All right, my iPad just switched over to 5:33, which means my Mac clock is going to follow suit in just a second. Breaks are never long enough, but when we shortened this from a 3-hour session to a 2-hour session so that we could have that Q&A time, we thought it was important to build even just a quick short one in, because again, it's that time of day. So I'm going to do a quick Unit 2 overview, and this is where we regain those couple of extra minutes I took with my Columbus Day part. But in terms of Unit 2, you're going to see one new icon appear on the screen, and that is a resource folder. And what we did was sometimes things, when Phil and I update things, we forget to relink it or we relink along a wrong thing. Or, as I noted before, sometimes we decide to remove something from a lesson, but it never actually goes away. So if you click on the resource folder little USB stick icon here, it actually is a backdoor into the Google Drive folder that houses everything for this unit. So it is one big, huge, giant dump of files, but it is everything that we have linked in the units. So if something ever disappears or you're like, gosh, I swear there used to be an activity here, most of the units have this resource folder that will take you into it. So I'm going to very quickly go over Unit 2, and then we have a small vein of fill here. So Unit 2 overall is covering all of your 1 standards. Those are the 1.1s, the 1.2s, and the 1.4s. We bring some of the 1.3s into Unit 3. And what that means, so I helped rewrite the social study standards a few years back. So I have all of these standards like memorized by heart at this point. Some of you are chuckling and you're like, yeah, that's nerdy. Chris Baxter actually knows I can do this. She's seen me and Charam rattle off standards off the top of my head. She's like, quick, Dave, what's 1.1.3? And I can tell her. So we cover in this unit it's the nerdiest parlor trick I have. So we cover in this unit the indigenous peoples, and I'll talk about that naming scheme in just a sec. We cover Europe and we cover the three worlds meeting. And so if you're looking at this and you're going, gosh, you're talking about three worlds meeting, but you've only talked about two worlds. That is because we put a big focus on the slave trade and Africa in the next unit. We do a little bit of it in this unit, but we put some very intentional pieces together in Unit 3, which we'll go over in October. So if you're looking at these standards and you're like, "Where's Africa?" We talk about Africa, but not enough in this unit that we felt comfortable putting the standards here. So just keep that in mind as you go through the unit. We really talk about those three areas. And our supporting questions that guide the overall question, how do cultures change as a result of contact? Our supporting questions for this, we've got a lesson that is centered around the push factors that led Europeans to leave Europe and seek out new places. We have a question about the indigenous peoples and how they lived and what their life and pathways were like. And then what are some positive and negative impacts of European encounters and exchanges? So this is always kind of a loaded question because we're like, well, gosh, when you think about what happened to some of the people that the European colonists encountered over time, can we really say that things were positive there? But there were some positive pieces, and we try to focus in on that as well. It just happens that in most history classes, we end up talking a lot about some of those negative impacts as well. So those are the supporting questions that kind of guide the unit. As far as Unit 1, Lesson 1 goes, this is where we really get into the push factors that led Europeans to leave. And we have another activity here on compelling and supporting questions if you want to do it here. This one is completely optional. It is actually very, very similar to one that is in 4th grade. And one of the reasons it's here is because Phil will chuckle as I tell this story. The original 5th grade writers wrote Units 1 and 2 and then quit and then didn't tell anyone that they quit. And so Phil, Becky, and I agreed to take over the writing of 5th grade at that point with Phil's help. And Phil, Becky Bush, and I sat down one day and we're like, gosh, we want to make sure that we have some good stuff here, but we don't have a Unit 2 to roll out tonight. So initially it started with this and then it snowballed into the rest of this lesson. But we left this here, even though it was also in fourth grade, because it is a good activity to sort of solidify with kids the compelling questions piece and what that is and how it fits into social studies. Um, Interestingly enough, I will be telling this exact same story tomorrow night with eighth grade. So I don't know what it was with us and our expectations for the US history writers, but the eighth grade team wrote Unit 0 and Unit 1 and also quit and didn't tell anybody. So Becky was like, Dave, will you come in and write these units as well? And I'm like, only if I can work with Phil. So Phil and I put the rest of them together. Um, Getting into this, Phil is going to talk a little bit about this prevailing winds, ocean currents, and trade presentation coming up in just a sec. But you can see we're referencing Open Book Chapter 2, and we've actually developed a reading guide to go along with Chapter 2 of Open Book. So if you've used Open Book in the past, here's where some of those Open Book specific pieces come in. Now, if you're not going to use Open Book to go along with this, that's totally fine. Just know you may have to adapt the reading guide just a little bit. But my hunch is, in just even eyeballing it here in the moment, my hunch is your book is still going to talk about these same things. So it's probably very minimal the amount of adaptations you'll have to make with some of that. And then we move a little bit further into the explorers. We do bring some Africa in here because you can't talk about the three worlds meeting without talking about Africa, but just know we go into more depth with that in the next unit. And then in our formative and summative assessment, when you finally get to the end of this unit, is to really have kids do something centered around what push factors led Europeans to explore new areas. So you could treat this as a formative by having kids write this or write their answers to this out so that you can kind of gauge how well did I do on those push and pull factors. Or you can put a grade in the grade book. Just know that when you do that, it's no longer a formative assessment, it's a summative assessment because you're attaching points and grades to it. So you can use some of these either way. And then as far as lesson 2 goes, we talk a little bit more about this is our Indigenous peoples heavy lesson. So there's a lot of stuff here. And quite frankly, we are always adding more to it. I actually haven't updated the version number. Part of the perk of my gig is I get to work with a lot of the tribal education groups, including the one out of Harbor Springs. With Eric Hemingway is just one of the most amazing people ever. We're actually going to try to bring him into a future unit rollout to talk a little bit more about Indigenous issues. But he is constantly like, hey, Dave, we need to add this, we need to add this, we need to add this. So I'm always adding stuff to the Indigenous peoples portion of Open Book and Giants based off of his stuff. And then the final lesson, lesson 3, is where we start to get into the three worlds meeting. We use the book Encounter by Jane Yolen as a literacy connection here. There's also, this is one that is easy to find on YouTube. We just can't link to it anymore because it's easy to find on YouTube, but the link that you use to find it disappears quite frequently. At some point, I'm going to actually download every YouTube video that we use in these units and these and Open Book, and I'm going to upload them back to YouTube as unlisted things that only I have like the links to update so that hopefully the stuff doesn't disappear anymore. Because it can sometimes be a full-time job chasing down some of those dead links. But this is the lesson that really gets into those three worlds meeting. We talk about the different European groups that are coming over and the interactions that they're having with the indigenous peoples. So overall, this whole unit is going to cover all of that stuff, and it's going to bring in unit 3 more on the beginnings of the slave trade. So with that, I have bought us back one of the 2 minutes that I lost us in my thing, and I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk prevailing winds, ocean currents, and trade, and then North America regions, and then Africa. So Phil, the next 30 minutes is you, bud.
Well, 29.
There you go. I could make that minute up later if we need to, though. So you take your 30 if you need it.
So I'm going to present one of the PowerPoints. I'm going to wave at one of the PowerPoints. I'm going to mention one of the PowerPoints. And then we're going to nose out into the clickable maps for a little while. and show you how some of that overlaps. So the first part, and why it's positioned right after the break, is this is the thing that previous fifth grade teachers have told me they didn't have in their content background, and it would have been really useful. Because what I'm going to talk about is the rivers in the ocean, Ben Franklin's idea about how the oceans worked, and how that helps us understand. And right at the end of the PowerPoint, it's going to list 12 different things that individually are just memorization, but when you put them together in this general map of what the rivers in the ocean look like, they all kind of make sense. And it's a case of learning one thing really well and saving you having to learn a dozen things sort of well. So to learn one thing really well, we'll start up a PowerPoint in there on rivers in the ocean. It was Ben Franklin's term for the ocean currents that he tried to show on one of his maps when he was an advisor for the Maritime Association at the time. So we'll give you a globe that's been tipped over so that it's got the angle that helps you focus on the Atlantic Ocean and the continents that are just around it. The PowerPoint names the continents. You can delete that frame if your kids don't need it, but the one thing we found out in New York was that a whole lot of eighth grade people don't know the names of the continents yet, at least in some urban areas. So the orange square out here marks the location of the Cape Verde Islands. These were a tremendously important stopping place for the sailing ships at the time. This is basically where the idea of a cotton plantation and a sugar plantation came from. And one little dude back in the 1500s, 1400s spent a couple months on the Cape Verde Islands holding up a wind gauge. His name was Christopher Columbus, and I suspect you're going to find out that he's an important part of history a little bit later on. What he noticed was that the winds tended to blow from the east almost all of the time. Now, this is just true, you know, at that latitude. Hawaii is at exactly that same latitude. And I had the terrible misfortune of having to go there as a visiting professor for 6 months one time in order to help out the budget of the University of Minnesota. And we noticed that you can stand on this desert hill. By the way, I'm standing on top of the mountain called Diamond Head, which is in a lot of the pictures of Waikiki. And you can take a picture of some rain clouds up there. We were there for 6 months, and we saw the top of the mountain on 4 days because those rain clouds are up there almost all the time. Meanwhile, if you're actually looking in the foreground of this picture, this is a desert. Diamond Head gets only 12 inches of rain. Our apartment got about 25 inches of rain. Palolo Valley, where I used to jog around for a little while, the rainfall gradient is basically 10 inches per block. Every block you go further up into the valley, you get 10 inches more rain. The top of the mountain on this side gets 150 inches, and on the other side of the mountain, it gets over 200 inches of rain. You say, well, what does this have to do anything? It's because the trade winds are blowing from the east. Now, was that in the news within the last couple of weeks when a couple little towns in Hawaii burned up because they happened to be on the east side of the island, on the west side of the island, and therefore were downhill from the mountains, and therefore were deserts, and therefore were prone to burn? Now, in Columbus's day, they didn't care much about rainfall on islands. What they cared about was that if you wanted to go west in a sailing ship, a wind that always blows from the east is good news, or is it? I mean, it's terrible news if you think that the world ends somewhere out there and the wind is always blowing from the east, because Your sailboat can't sail against the wind. Oh, and by the way, to make things even worse, the wind pushes ocean water along with it. And when the wind is pushing the ocean water over that way, even if you put your sails down and rowed like mad, you would not be able to. This is one of the reasons that the early sailors called that end of Africa the point of death. They said if you sailed out past that, essentially you were dead. And probably somewhere between 150 and 200 ships from Europe made the mistake of sailing out past the Cape Verde Islands and were not able to come back home. So as that water is pushed across the ocean, it gets warmer and warmer because it's flowing close to the equator. And that warm water makes hurricanes. In fact, what I'm showing you right now is a perfect map of the hurricane that is right off the coast of eastern North America right now. Because the water can't keep going that way, it's got to turn since it's run into the continent there. And this is what Ben Franklin observed, that the water off of the shore was flowing toward the north and it was fairly hot. Eventually, that water gets up to the latitude of the Great Lakes, and where we are, the wind blows more often from the west. And so it's going to push the water back across the ocean over the other way. And that is basically the circulation system of the ocean. Now, why is that important? It helps you understand why Great Britain and Spain and Portugal turned out to be the major explorers, because they were the ones that had access to those ocean currents that would go out over the ocean there. Then it could carry them over to North America and back. Now, Benjamin Franklin made the first map of that. This is his map of what he called the river in the ocean, that river of hot water that was flowing up along the East Coast. He was especially interested in that part of it. A modern map of temperature in the ocean shows you very clearly how that warm water is going up that way. That gave us an idea for a printed activity, which you can download from the Giants website. If you don't want to go through the PowerPoint, you want to go at it from an inquiry point of view, these are actual measurements of the average ocean water temperature on a whole bunch of locations on each side. And I know from personal experience doing a little bit of surfing that the waves aren't very good on the East Coast here, but the temperature is just wonderful, 85 degrees out over there. You try doing that where the waves are better off of California and the temperature is 69 degrees, and if you don't have an insulated wetsuit on, you are going to have one miserable afternoon. And then the activity goes step by step through why we wind up with the fact that the East Coast at the same latitude is always about 20 degrees warmer than the West Coast is. That also explains why we have hurricanes over here, why we've got a whole lot of rainfall on this side of the continent, and why it tends to be dry over on this side over here. Now let's take a look at what this did during the era of colonial trade. Somebody from Britain could just drop a boat into the ocean and it would wind up flowing south. It was just great because you were fresh, you had all your ammunition, you could go right by Spain and shoot up a couple cities, and then you could go out across the ocean. And if you take a look at just riding those ocean currents around there, you're going to understand an interesting fact, that this was an automatic gold delivery system for the British. That the Spanish ships, if they went on here, they're going out across the ocean, they're loading up with gold in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in Panama. Then they're coming back They've caught a couple tropical diseases. They've had a couple fights. People are injured. They're tired. They're low on ammunition. And then they wind up going right by Great Britain, and Britain could send out somebody like Sir Francis Drake, and he could capture the Spanish ships. And now we've got the reason why the Spain thought that they needed an armada, but it also explains why the armada failed. Now, that's not a fifth grade statement, but the fifth grade statements that this was a circulation system that had a particular set of consequences as to where you would land over here and how you would travel when you were going across that ocean. It's easy to understand, by the way, but it hides a secret in the deep ocean, and that is that the north flowing warm water is about 5 times as much as the south flowing cold water. And this is a real puzzle. And the answer to the puzzle is it's because a lot of that north flowing warm water gets up to this latitude. It gets cold because there's icebergs. It sinks down to the bottom and it flows to the bottom. And some climatologists are just worried that this whole system, when and if it breaks down, will do so very suddenly. It is probably the single biggest worry of climatologists. And it illustrates one fact. From a climate scientist point of view, climate change is not about temperature. It's not about hot days. It's not about fires in Hawaii. It's about the possibility that we're messing with the circulation system of the ocean and we don't understand it real well. Now, that's not a fifth grade thing, but it's something to have in the back of your mind when people bring up questions about climate change, is that it's about a lot more than just temperature. In other words, the circular flow of ocean water is a powerful idea. It's worth teaching because it can help you understand a whole lot of other facts. And for that reason, we've got 2 different versions of a printed activity that goes step by step through. You can give this printed activity to your students and have them trace while you're doing the PowerPoint, or they can go home and just do it as a take-home activity and then test it against the PowerPoint. There's lots of different ways you could approach it, and we'd actually like your advice as to what you tried and how well you thought it worked. I have one single summary frame at the end of this PowerPoint as to what just knowing about this simple little circulation can help you understand. It can help you understand why early sailors were terrified to go south around Africa until we invented the lateen sail and compasses and things like that. It helps you understand why Columbus landed on an island and not on North America. It helps understand why every European country wanted a piece of South America, so that there are countries in South America that speak Spanish, French, Dutch, English, and Portuguese. It helps you understand why beaches are warmer in Florida than in California, why millions live in northwestern Europe, and the same latitude in northeastern Canada is practically empty. Why Spanish gold ships were tempting targets for the English, why the Armada was necessary, why most people in the United States speak English is because England was kind of fated to win the war just because of the way the circulation system allowed them to be more effective militarily. It helps explain why that part of Africa is a desert, as is Southern California, why hurricanes are very common off of Miami and extremely rare off of California, why fishing is good near Newfoundland, why icebergs tend to drift eastward toward Europe and knock down ships like the Titanic and things like that on the way, and why climatologists think that changing ocean currents are a serious risk right at the moment, and something that just doesn't show up in the news very much, but it's a problem. Now, the main point was, rather than try to memorize all of this, as a dozen separate attacks, we should cite to help students understand the system and see that the facts are logical consequences of a real simple process. So, like I said, we've got a couple different printed activities and a PowerPoint to support that.